Hey everybody, it's your life science and biology teacher, Mr. Poser. Today we are continuing our second unit on the chemistry of life by getting into our second topic, which is on the molecules of life, aka biomolecules, aka biological macromolecules. And what I'd like to start off with today is a question about a particular diet trend that's been really coming up in the last, 4 or 5 years or so. And it's called the keto diet or ketosis diet. And what has been shown is that perhaps keto has been treated like a weight loss miracle diet, and it's been worked out for so many people and they've lost so much weight. And the whole idea behind the ketosis diet or the keto diet or keto acetone diet is that if you avoid carbohydrates as much as possible, then your body will use fat for energy rather than those carbs, and thus you will lose fat and you will lose weight. Is this true, and is this a good idea? Is it a really good idea to try to avoid as many carbs as possible? Well, let's find out once we get a grip on what exactly carbs are and relative to perhaps the other types of biomolecules that we get from our food. So let's get started. All right, this is where we left off in our last video. We talked about the impact of glucose, and glucose is what we consider to be like the starting molecule for lots of biochemical metabolism. So I put living things form complex carbon-based molecules like the ones that we're going to talk about today using atoms from food, which usually starts with this particular molecule, glucose, which is the chemical formula is C6H12O6. So it has one ring of carbon here. And that is indicative that glucose is a type of carbohydrate, which is our first biomolecule that we're going to talk about today. So a carbohydrate is a molecule that's broken down quickly for easily usable energy, and it's made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms, which is what makes it a carbohydrate. Carbo referring to carbon, hydrate referring to H and O, or hydrogen and oxygen. The building block of carbohydrates, also known as the monomer of carbohydrates, is called a monosaccharide. So, for example, glucose is a monosaccharide on account of the fact that it's made of one carbon ring. And a food that you can get a lot of carbs from, which is what keto people actively avoid, are things like grains. Okay, grains have a lot of what we call complex carbohydrates. So your breads, your pastas, that kind of stuff, rice. Also, though, we don't want to promote the notion that carbs are only found in grains, because sugars in general are also carbohydrates. They're what we call simple sugars. So glucose itself, it's more like it's a sweet sugar, while the carbohydrates, aka the sugars found in these grains, are going to be what are called complex carbs, which are a bunch of monosaccharides or monomers linked together. So it's a really long chain of these glucose molecules. That's what you're going to find in these foods over here. So fruits and veggies are also a very good source of carbs in the fact that they have a lot of simple sugars. Okay, so why are carbs particularly important? Well, or glucose particularly important, is because the chemical energy from glucose and other monosaccharides and disaccharides like it is transferred to ATP, which is, you don't have to memorize this, but it's called adenosine triphosphate. And this molecule is really like the energy currency molecule of life. Now, we don't want to promote the idea that ATP is energy, but it is the energy carrying molecule that all cells need to do their everyday essential functions. So ATP provides energy for cellular processes. Okay? You're dead if you don't have enough ATP. What eventually will cause death in most living things is a complete loss of ATP. All right? Cells cannot function without ATP. And the cell's number one way to get ATP is from glucose. And the reaction, the set of reactions that convert glucose into ATP, is a topic that we're going to get into later this year. It's called cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is done by a special organelle, the powerhouse of the cell, called mitochondria. You may have heard of it before. And what the mitochondria do in your cells is they combine glucose, they take the energy from glucose and use oxygen to produce as much ATP of this energy currency molecule, a lot of cellular energy, as possible. So one glucose molecule, according to our reaction, our equation down here, one glucose molecule can be used to make 36 ATP molecules. And as I put in this second bullet point right here, ATP is used to drive other reactions. Okay, so ATP is very, very, very important, and thus glucose is also very important on account of the fact that glucose, not only can it be used in cellular respiration to make ATP, it can also be stored in what's called a polysaccharide. So like the types of carbs that you're going to find in grains and breads are like starch, and starch is a plant's way of storing glucose. Our bodies can also store glucose in another polysaccharide called glycogen. But anyway, my point is that it can be stored, it can be used to make a bunch of ATP, and glucose can be used to be converted to other biomolecules such as proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. So glucose is really one of the central molecules of all metabolism. And if you remember from the last video, metabolism is just all of the chemical reactions that occur within a living thing. And glucose is really at the center of it because it can be stored, turned to ATP, or converted into other biomolecules. Speaking of other biomolecules, this is a chart that I'm going to be using, that I'm going to be filling out throughout this video, talking about the atoms that make up a biomolecule, the function of that biomolecule, the monomer or the building block of that type of biomolecule, and the source of the food source that you can get each of these biomolecules from. Okay? And as we said, glucose can be converted into all three of these other ones. So what are these three other ones? Well, the first are called lipids, also known as different types of fats, even though a fat is only one kind of lipid. But lipids are nonpolar molecules used for long-term energy and to build cell membranes. And typically, lipids are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms, very similar to carbohydrates. Now, the types of lipids that make cell membranes, they also have phosphorus, but we'll talk about that another day. The building block molecules of lipids are called fatty acids, and we have some pictures of them over here. These are all really long chains of carbon and hydrogen, and some of these have a double bond, some of them don't. Okay, so lipids are typically good for you. Now, if we're talking about the difference between a saturated fatty acid and an unsaturated fatty acid, one of those might be better than the other, just on account of how they behave or their properties at room temperature or at body temperature. Saturated fats tend to be solid at body temperature and room temperature. Unsaturated fats tend to be liquid at body temperature and room temperature. So which one of those would you rather have running through your arteries and veins? Probably the unsaturated one that's going to be liquid at room temperature. But anyway, lipids are essential for long-term energy and to build cell membranes. So everybody needs lipids. Everybody needs some kind of fat. If anybody tells you that, oh, I don't have any body fat, 0% body fat, they're lying to you and they're probably very sick. But here's lipids. Again, what I just said is that a good source of lipids come from fats and oils. You can get these from like nuts and like certain types of fruits and veggies, and lots of different animal products too have lipids in them as well. Hey, the monomer is a fatty acid. As I said, long-term energy in cell membranes is the function. And the same atoms make up carbohydrates are the ones that make up lipids, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Let's get into proteins now. Proteins is everybody's best friend, a bodybuilder's best friend, right? Well, it's kind of sad that as soon as we hear the word protein, typically we think of muscle and we think of, building muscle mass, which is very true because muscles are made primarily of protein. But proteins are really, really essential for the function of a cell because they do pretty much everything. Okay, so proteins are what I like to call the building blocks of life on account of the fact that they carry out all sorts of different essential cell functions. Okay, proteins do pretty much everything for a cell. And without these proteins, we wouldn't have living things. We wouldn't have life. So proteins are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, very much like our other biomolecules. But there's also nitrogen and sometimes sulfur atoms in proteins as well. Okay. So proteins do pretty much everything, and this is what they kind of look like at different structural levels. Now, we don't have to get into them, but it can get pretty complicated. And what these are, they're really long chains of these building block molecules called amino acids. So a long chain of amino acids are what help make up a protein. So the monomer of proteins are called amino acids, and there's 20 different kinds of them. Okay, so some protein-rich foods, we're talking, again, more animal products. Nuts, legumes are really high sources of these proteins. Okay, and again, what your body's going to do with these are break down those proteins that you get from your food, from these animal products, legumes, and nuts, and take them apart into these amino acids and then rearrange those amino acids into proteins that your cells can actually use. That's what metabolism is about. All right, last biomolecule that we're going to talk about, we won't get into it too much because we will much later in this school year. We'll get very in-depth on these types of biomolecules. They are nucleic acids. And nucleic acids, your DNA, your molecular blueprint, what makes you you, and whatever you don't want to leave behind at a crime scene that you did, right? These are really just the instruction books for cells to make special kinds of proteins. Proteins have a very wide variety, and cells need very specific instructions in order to build these proteins and build them properly. So nucleic acids, like your DNA, is very extensive. It's a very large molecule that's packaged into the nucleus of each cell. And your cells reference this molecular instructions in order to build proteins properly. So they are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, just like all the other ones, nitrogen, and also phosphorus atoms. That's what we can find in nucleic acids. And these really long chains of DNA, are the building blocks that make up these really long chains are called nucleotides. Okay, so the monomer of a nucleic acid is called a nucleotide, and we'll discuss more of these later this school year. All right, so here's our completed chart. Our last column here is on nucleic acids, and here it is. The atoms are CHO, N, and P. They're the instructions for building proteins. The monomer is a nucleotide, and they're found in all living things as a food source. So there you have it. Okay, so how about this? Well, let's come back to this question at the beginning. The ketogenic diet, or ketosis diet, it's the ketogenic diet. It eliminates nearly all carbohydrates from your diet. Are there pros and cons to it? Well, we talked about what carbohydrates, and particularly glucose, do, but really, in reality, there are some pros and cons to the ketogenic diet. A pro is that your body, like I said before, uses fats for energy. Remember, lipids are long-term energy storage, and if you're not having carbs, then your body's more likely to turn to those lipids for energy. You can take in less food on account of it because your body's tapping into your storage. It does usually result in weight loss, and for somebody who's diabetic who has to monitor how many carbohydrates they have in their blood, this can actually be a pretty good diet for them to avoid carbs. Okay? But a con is that carbohydrates are the #1 source of energy for the nervous system. Your brain is a huge ATP hog, and your carbohydrates are the main way that your cells get ATP. So maybe that's not a great thing. This can also result in what's called keto flu, where you build too much of a particular byproduct of these compounds, too much in your blood, and it can make you feel sick. And then finally, by taking in a lot of fats and taking in a lot of proteins and cutting out carbs completely, these can raise cholesterol and build up fats in your bloodstream, and it actually increases the risk of heart attack and stroke. So again, like all diets, there's pros and cons to it, but hopefully you'll gain some insight into what this is about after studying these biomolecules. All right, that'll be it for me. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you later.